fall semester of our Great Debates panel series, and Dr. Stacy, who normally organizes these, is not able to be here today, so she left it to me to try to make this work. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then our moderator, and then we're going to get started. And I'm going to take a little bit of time to do these introductions because I'm really pleased with the folks that we have on the panel, right? For those who don't know, I am James Davenport. I am the Associate Dean, at least for a few more weeks, of the Liberal Arts and Sciences, also the Director for the Center for Civic Engagement here at Rose State, and we are happy to be part of this discussion. The question we're looking at today is, should Oklahomans vote to increase the state's minimum wage? Which, if you don't know, an initiative petition was successfully circulated, got well over the requisite number of signatures to be put on ballot. The governor did schedule that election for that issue, but with the primary elections in 2026, so that's like June of 2026. And so I'm sure we'll discuss that as well during the course of this conversation. And so this is a kind of a timely thing. The petition was just certified, the vote was scheduled, and people will be talking about this, I'm sure, over the next almost 18 or more months. Right? So without further ado, let me introduce our panels. For, I think, the affirmative is Dr. Travis Rhodes. Is that right? Okay. Dr. Travis Rhodes is an associate professor and the chairperson of the Department of Economics at the University of Central Oklahoma. He is also the founding director of the Central Policy Institute, which is an interdisciplinary research center housed in UCO's College of Business. He earned his bachelor's degree in both music and economics at the University of North Texas, and he completed his PhD in economics at Texas Tech University. His research interests include economic policy, labor economics, industrial organization, and environmental economics. And his research has been published in a variety of academic journals, including Energy and Economics, Economics Letters, Economic Inquiry, and Education Economics, as well as the Journal of Economics Race Policy. Dr. Rhodes' work has been featured in a variety of news publications, both locally and around the world, including in outlets in Canada and Australia. And he's also been awarded a grant from the National Science Foundation to study the economic effects of reduced seismic activity. And he has worked with the Oklahoma Department of Veterans Affairs on the prevalence of suicide among veterans. Dr. Rhodes teaches a variety of classes, including economics and social issues, introduction to economics, principles of microeconomics, game theory, energy economics, economics of crime, and labor economics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Travis Rhodes. Next, sitting right next to Dr. Rhodes is Gabriela Ramirez-Perez. Gabriela joined the Oklahoma Policy Institute as an immigration policy analyst in August of 2021. She graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a bachelor's degree in international studies and minors in German, Arabic, and international security studies. You were busy. Ms. Perez has held internships with the Council on American Islamic Relations in Oklahoma and with the Office of Former Congresswoman Ken Reform. She's also been active in helping first-generation students know how to attend college successfully. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Gabriela Ramirez-Perez. Next is Dr. Samantha Johnson, who is a lecturer at the Department of Economics at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Johnson earned her bachelor's degree in economics and finance at Black Hills State University in South Dakota, and her master's degree and PhD in economics at Washington State University. Dr. Johnson's current research focuses on agricultural cartels and marketing orders. However, she also has interest in sustainability, education, labor, and environmental and natural resources, as well as behavioral economics and industrial organization. The courses Dr. Johnson has taught include principles of microeconomics, intermediate microeconomics, principles of macroeconomics, labor problems, and managerial economics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith. And finally, I get to introduce our moderator, who it is both an honor and a privilege to do so, Dr. Sue Lynn Sasser. I personally regard Dr. Sasser as one of my academic mentors. She helped kind of reignite my passion for teaching, which led me showing up here at Rose City College. And she also was instrumental in opening up the opportunity to immerse myself in a completely new field, economics, which included several years of teaching as an adjunct in UCO's economics department. Dr. Sue Lynn Sasser is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Economics and at the University of Central Oklahoma. She's the past director of the UCO Center for Economic Education and past executive director for the Oklahoma Council on Economic Education. In addition, Dr. Sasser served as the first president of the Oklahoma Jumpstart Coalition for Personal Financial Literacy and is a past president of the National Association of Economic Educators. During her tenure at UCO, Dr. Sasser was selected for numerous awards and recognitions, including being selected as one of the top 50 women in Oklahoma by the Journal Record, being nominated for the William Odom Award, which is the highest honor given by the National Jumpstart Coalition for Personal Financial Literacy. Dr. Sasser is also one of the few educators to receive the Friend of the Family Award from the American Association of Family and Consumer Sciences for her work in financial literacy. Dr. Sasser is an award-winning author of several economics and personal finance educational materials and has published research in a variety of economic and personal finance publications. In addition to her 30 years of teaching, Dr. Sasser also held positions with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas and the Texas Agricultural Extension Service. Dr. Sasser remains active in various projects related to economics and personal finance and continues to volunteer for several UCO-related activities. So please join me in welcoming our moderator, Dr. Sue Lynn Sasser.
Thank you, James and Samantha. I forgot to mention, I taught at University of South Dakota, so we have a bit of a connection here from South Dakota. So, and I spent my summers teaching at Black Hill State. And I have to say, teaching out in the hills and teaching in Oklahoma are two different totally experiences. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in South Dakota, but it was nice to come back home, having grown up in Lawton and being in UCO alum, so it was a great privilege. But thank you, and thank you to each of our panelists for being here. We'll go ahead and kind of get started with the questions. We've got 5 or 6 questions that are a bit lengthy. They don't require or you can't answer those using yes or no answers. So we're going to give each panelist the time to complete their answer. And hopefully at the end of the discussion, we'll have time to take questions from the audience as well. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. And I think we'll start with the pros at the end for the first question, and then we'll move this way. James, if that's okay with you, since you're sitting the closest to me. Okay, so the first question that we have is, describe your position on raising the minimum wage. Why do you or your organization believe that reform is necessary, or is it really necessary? And then most of all, perhaps for importance, who would benefit from minimum wage increases, but also are there losers?
Yes, so hi, I'm Gabriela Ramirez Perez, and in addition to immigration, I also work on economic security as a policy analyst. So the question about raising the minimum wage is a citizen-initiated ballot initiative, and the Oklahoma Policy Institute decided to support this initiative because it's been 15 years since we raised the minimum wage, meaning that the real earnings of the lowest wage earners in Oklahoma hasn't really managed to come up at the same rates. Yes, it's been pushed up with a tight competition, tight labor market. Employers are raising the wages on their own, but there are many low-wage Oklahomans that still earn at minimum wage or near minimum wage. So we've decided to support it because we know that when Oklahomans are economically secure, then there's better outcomes, not just for them, but the economy as a whole. So taking that point of view, who would benefit? Yes, Oklahoma's low-wage earners, but also the economy as a whole. If we think about this question in a black and white perspective between winners and losers, then sure, we may come to some conclusion that the winners are those who benefit directly, and the losers are the people who have to pay those higher wages. However, we can't forget that important quote, a rising tide lifts all boats, and the economy is a complex thing. So whenever Oklahomans are making more money, whenever they have more spendable income, that's money that goes right back into the economy. And so that's, instead of living paycheck to paycheck and struggling to pay rent, to go to the doctor, now there's money in their pockets that they can spend at a local restaurant, at a local small business. They can get their car repaired. And so in that sense, it's also the business community that is benefiting from an increase in the minimum wage. It may not be as directly, but we all live in the same community, we all spend in the same community, it goes right back and cycles through. So we've decided to support it, and yeah.
Hi everyone. So I should put it out there that the University of Central Oklahoma does not have a position on the minimum wage. And so I work there, but my position on this is not representative of the universities. So that being said, I've done a lot of research and I've kept up with the modern methods that we've used to study the effects of a minimum wage changing. And following the data, following the empirics, that's what's brought me into support of this one. Now, I should say that each policy change is different. So if you ask, do you support the minimum wage going up? I'd answer, it depends. In our case, the size of the minimum wage increase that they're seeking, I do not feel will cause any negative economic ramifications. That's in part because we've seen in other areas that it is not followed by mass unemployment. It's not followed by huge rising prices, and we can get into more specifics later. So that's part of what brought me to this position. In this case, I am in the affirmative. I would vote in favor of it. One of the funnier experiences in my life, I was on a similar debate panel like this, talking about the minimum wage probably 3 or 4 years ago. So we've been talking about this for a minute. And I was next to State Commissioner of Labor, Leslie Osborne, who's a statewide Republican official. I kind of went into that conversation going, man, I wonder what this is going to be like. I felt very out of my depth being next to the labor commissioner. We might as well have had the same slides. So she viewed this the same way. She came to it going, I can see a need to do this, and that I do not expect much negative downside from that. And then to kind of talk about who benefits and who is hurt by it, I think the obvious ones are there, but I do view this as a kind of pro-business policy. This will have the knock-on effect of helping people become more productive. So if you imagine, the last time the minimum wage changed, I was earning the minimum wage. So I feel this really, but like if you're currently earning the minimum wage, the odds that you have a second job or are doing Uber or some kind of work in the gig economy means you're working several hours of your life. And if you're able to pull back on some of that additional work, that's more time that you can spend with your child. That's more time you can spend, for instance, sleeping before the next day. So the productivity boost we can see there is one of those knock-on effects where you're able to, the other 16 hours of your life that day, get to go to other activities like raising your child. And there's this one other bit of research that sticks out in my head, is that we've seen in states that have changed their minimum wage, is that recidivism falls. So recidivism is if you go, say you go to jail for some reason, and you get out, what's the likelihood that you go back to jail again? That recidivism rate falling is a big deal because most crime that occurs is not like the Fast and Furious boosting cars, big time drug lord type crime. It's more petty theft, it's more larceny, which I'm not excusing or saying is good. But if the decision is, should I steal some of these items to supplement my income, or I'm now earning about $1 or $2 more per hour, I don't have to do that. That's kind of the mechanism by which that flows. And so keeping people out of jail, keeping our expenses on our jails lower, is one of these kind of sneaky benefits from raising wage. I've talked too much on here.
Okay, let's hear from the other side.
Okay, so I'm glad you made that disclaimer because I also need to make a similar disclaimer. OU does not take a stance one way or the other. This is just me taking the negative approach on this. So in economics, we have a concept of the law of demand. So when price goes up, people buy less, and vice versa. So when you raise the minimum wage, you are raising the cost of labor, which means that firms will naturally want to hire less. And that is something that has been seen. So in Seattle, they raised the minimum wage, I believe it was $13 about 10-ish years ago. And there was a big study done by the University of Washington, and they found that when they rose the minimum wage, a lot of people that were employed lost their jobs. And although a lot of those that were employed had their hours cut back. So are there going to be winners and losers if a minimum wage would go through? Yes. The people that kept their jobs, definitely, they would keep that higher wage. They have more money. That's great. But you have a section of the population that will no longer have a job or may have their hours cut, so they're actually worse off by that. And then on top of that, you have what we call an added unemployment. So there's people that were out of the labor market. They weren't considering it. They were staying out of it. The wage wasn't high enough. And now the wage is high enough that they want to enter, they want to look for a job. But firms aren't hiring. So now those people that were happy before now entered the workforce trying to find a job and they couldn't find one. Right? So you kind of are hitting yourself with kind of a double whammy. So yes, some people benefit. If they're the ones that kept their job, they're able to keep the hours, great, they're going to benefit. But you're going to have a lot of people that won't get hired, they're going to have their hours cut, or people that look for a job and won't find one. Right? And that doesn't even consider, will it have an actual impact, right? If you go get a job now, I believe the federal and Oklahoma minimum wage is still 7.25, which I also made. If you go find a job now, you're not going to find one for $7.25. And I actually looked this up. It was $12, $13, $14. The proposal doesn't even reach that. So it's not going to have an impact anyway. So what's the point? What's the reasoning behind doing all this government policy, putting things up for a vote for something that doesn't matter? There's a lot of issues that we might want to consider instead of something that won't really have a true impact.
I guess I'll be the third one to have a disclaimer that neither Rose State College nor the Center for Civic Engagement have an official position on this question. I'm opposed to this particular minimum wage increase largely because I don't like bringing a sledgehammer to heart surgery. I don't think it's an effective tool. And what I mean by that is when we look at actual minimum wage earners, first of all, they make up roughly about 2% of the overall workforce. So very, very tiny fraction of the overall workforce actually earn as low as the minimum wage. Of those, almost half, somewhere between 45 and 50%, are ages 16 to 25 that are working part-time jobs while they're in school. The other remainder, there's a significant number that don't come from households that are actually in poverty, right? You have a spouse working a secondhand job just for extra spending money, or you have a retiree who's doing the same thing. They have their retirement benefits, but they just want to be out and doing something, and so they're working, and they're not in poverty either. In fact, Dr. Robert Gill from the Indiana State University estimates that about 80% of minimum wage increases accrue to people who are not in poverty. But that's not who we're told we're trying to help when we're trying to raise the minimum wage, right? We're worried about those who are at the very lowest in the income spectrum. So I think we're using the wrong tool that creates more problems because it's not tailored to meet what is legitimate, right? This is not to say there's nobody who's earning the minimum wage who's not struggling. That's not meant to say that, but it's a much smaller fraction than we often assume, and we have better policy tools with which to address that. So that's the first reason. I think the second reason is, and I'm sure we're going to have a good discussion about this, I do think the preponderance of the evidence weighs in favor that there are negative effects of minimum wages, especially on those at the lowest end of the income spectrum, those who are the least educated, have the least job experience, and least human capital development, right? Those are the folks who are going to be hit the hardest by raising the cost of them being able to work somewhere. So I think that the minimum wage is the wrong tool for this problem. I think it causes more harm than damage, and I think we have better policy tools to address it.
Okay, thank you. And one of the things I like about discussions like this is it brings together the concepts of economics and finance political science, plus just all the spectrums. You know, life doesn't take place in silos like it does in education. And so this is really a very interdisciplinary issue. You can see from the answers, the very interdisciplinary approach. So let's move on then to the next question. What is the correlation between the minimum wage and job creation or retention, or is there a correlation? Would increasing the minimum wage create or eliminate jobs? We've discussed a little bit, but let's expand on that. And is there a moral argument to raise the minimum wage to reduce poverty among the working class? Again, expand on some of the things that were initially introduced. And let's start with James and Sam this time.
This will probably be the longest answer, because I think it's important to talk about what those who have studied this issue have come to conclude. And so I'm gonna be rattling off a few studies and their findings, which I'm sure some of our other panelists will do as well. I'm gonna start with one that I mentioned already, Robert Gale, who has what I think is a fantastic textbook called Issues in Economics Today, has an entire chapter devoted just to the minimum wage and examining what researchers have found. In that book, he says that past minimum wage increases were estimated to have cost between 360 to over 1 million job losses among teenage workers. He says that labor economists predominantly agree that a 10% increase in the minimum wage will result in a 1 to 3% reduction in employment for the least skilled, least experienced, and least educated workers. And that the earned income tax credit is a much better policy tool to help those who are at the low income, because it's more targeted to those in actual need, and it has little negative impact on the labor market. A 2015 study by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis found that higher minimum wages result in job losses for the least skilled workers. These negative effects are likely larger than what had been estimated, they said, because of some of the flaws in some of the studies that they were reviewing. A July 2022 study from Hearst, Kehoe, Pastorino, and Winberry found that high minimum wages reduced employment, income, and welfare of precisely the lowest income workers over the long term. And again, they also confirmed that the EITC was a much better tool to address this issue. Then finally, I just want to mention a study by Newmark and Shirley that was also in 2022, which they found they did a survey of the actual literature. So they weren't doing a minimum wage study, they were looking at the literature on the minimum wage. What they found was that 79% of the research on the minimum wage since the early 90s, when the Carden-Kruger initial minimum wage study that caused kind of this change in how we look at it, so 79% of that did in fact find negative impacts and increased minimum wages. That proportion held regardless of the construction of the study, so whether they were looking at state level, federal level, trying to compare states, or even if they were looking within a state, a very narrow slice of comparison. So they found that. And I just want to leave you with a few comments that they concluded their study with, right? There's strong and consistent evidence of negative employment effects for teens, young adults, the less educated, and those directly affected, meaning primarily low wage and low skilled workers, all right? That those studies that found no disemployment effects were generally studies within specific industries, and they concluded that what was happening was not that low skilled people were not losing their jobs, but there was labor substitution. They were being replaced by higher skilled people in those jobs. And finally, they said that concluding that the research evidence as a whole fails to find disemployment effects of minimum wages requires discarding or ignoring most of the evidence on low-skilled workers, relying on industry studies where labor substitution is more likely to match job loss among the least skilled workers. So that's my statement, and I'm sticking to it.
So I already kind of mentioned this a little bit, but the Carden-Kruger paper, which did make a big splash, a lot of it, when they actually went back and they used administrative data, they found they didn't get the same result. They got the 1 to 3% loss. The University of Washington study, this was back in 2013, they used government data throughout the entire state. So every single low wage job in the state of Washington. Washington is a pretty significant and very diverse area. They found losses in jobs, losses in hours, and especially hit hard was those low wage workers. And you talked about the substitutability, which I think was good too. So in places that, workers are getting that minimum wage, we started to see when they proposed the higher minimum wage or the labor market started to increase the wage, we started to see substitution. So when I was younger, when I was in college, you'd go to McDonald's and you would talk to a person, you would order that way. And now you started to see those, kind of joke, the little kiosks that you order from, right? That is a direct substitution because firms say, hey, we don't want to pay this higher labor cost. It is cheaper for us to substitute. And the workers that are going to be hurt are the ones that were making that minimum wage. So firms are already starting to substitute, and the higher that cost gets, the more incentive they have to switch. So there is paper after paper, study after study that just shows that it is going to have a big decrease on the number of people working and the hours worked. So there is one paper that is very known that Carter Kruger for making the opposite claim, but so many papers have come out afterwards saying, nope, we looked at the data, it's not what we found. Other papers have tried new studies, found similar losses in jobs, and the data says it just doesn't work.
Okay, let's hear from the other side.
Okay, so they're absolutely correct. There are a ton of papers out there that find negative disemployment effects. I'm not going to say that there aren't. There's also so many out there that come out with what are at best, I would call it null results. So we raise the minimum wage and kind of it's boring, nothing happened. One of the famous, or one of the leading authors in this area is Aaron Dubé. He's at University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's kind of looked in other countries, the United States. He actually recently contributed to the newest handbook of labor economics, looking at exactly this problem. Because we do have so many studies at different, scopes. If we're zooming in our microphone very fine or widening out, and he found more or less the opposite. Is even in his survey of these papers, if you look at what's called the own wage elasticity, that we're not seeing these massive disemployment effects. That mostly it's basically that nothing. It kind of comes out in the wash. Part of this is because there's job-to-job transitions to other industries. Part of it is, and there are some reductions in hours. We've seen some studies that look at, for instance, McDonald's specifically. They call them McWages just to see what's happening. Because a McDonald's in Oklahoma is very similar to a McDonald's in Missouri. Missouri recently raised their minimum wage. Their minimum wage goes up with the rate of inflation. And employment at these two McDonald's here and there is essentially the same. So that's why you get this very boring result that not much happens. A few other things just to comment on what my colleagues here have said. The earned income tax credit is just about the best economic policy out there in the world, and I hope politicians never learn what it is. I love that it has a boring name. As soon as it becomes political, then it will be a thing that one side has to hate because the other likes it. I hope it stays off the radar for the rest of my life, just because it's a boring good policy, and I like boring good policies to stick around. And then let's suppose just one last thing, that there is a 1% employment change. Let's say that that's true. Well, 99% of the workers there just had an improvement in their lives. And so I do feel something for that person who may have lost their job. But if we can improve the lives of 99 people at the expense of one person, to me personally, I'm willing to take that trade-off. If there are these other trickle-out positive externality effects of raising the wage for these 99 other people, then that is net beneficial.
Yes, definitely want to echo the EITC, earned income tax credit. Great. Oklahoma can do some work to improve theirs. They need to start meddling into politics. But yeah, there's studies out there that say raising the minimum wage will result in many job losses. There's others that say you don't. And if you want to go out there and look at this research, I recommend something you really hone in is the methodology to see how they come to these conclusions. But the one I wanted to uplift is that recently the Economic Policy Institute did a review of literature. So as you said, the survey of literature, and they said that overall, most minimum wage studies have found little to no job loss. And part of the methodology was expanding outside of teenagers because, 80% of low wage earners are age 20 and up. And if teenagers are working less, maybe there's an argument that that's good. Because if they make more wages, they don't have to work as long and they can focus on school. So really expanding the scope of who you're looking at whenever we're looking at the effects of minimum wage increases makes a difference. And that review of literature, and they have lots of research on it, also finds that, there are basically very little job losses, small disemployment effects to no job losses. And the vast majority of it suggests that overall, the benefits from increasing the total earnings of low-wage earners is a great benefit that outweighs those few disemployment effects that do occur. Something I also want to mention is that research has shown that small businesses can absorb these wage increases. They can reap the economic benefits, and part of the discussion on this is that raising the minimum wage is not a job killer, but it's a job vacancy killer. What does that mean? It means that workers are cycling less through jobs, because if you're getting paid a low wage at this certain place, then you're gonna look for somewhere that pays more because you need that money to pay your bills. But if you get paid more, you stay at that job, you build up your skills, you're more productive, and that saves businesses the cost of having to rehire, to advertise, all of that, and helps workers because now they're making higher wages. And so, to answer the last part of your question, which was the moral dimension, at OK Policy, we don't deny that you can make a moral argument on raising the minimum wage. But as a data-driven policy institute, we focus on facts. And the facts are that whenever families have higher incomes, when they're more economically secure, parents and children have better mental and physical health outcomes. They have better educational outcomes. They have reduced rates. There's reduced rates of child abuse. And so, put simply, when parents earn higher wages, they can afford the goods and services they need to care for their children, for their development, and spend more time with them. So you're not in this survival mindset. You can now spend this time and with your children, your families, taking care of an elderly loved one. And so the benefits of having that increased wage, even if your hours are cut, you're making more money than you were before. And overall, we see that as having a positive effect.
So I think all the different studies reminds me of an old economics joke, because you can take all the economists in the world, line them up head to toe, stretch them out around the world, and they still couldn't agree on which direction they were pointing. Or as our bank president in Dallas used to say, he'd go, that's not a bad idea. Okay, next question. Does raising the minimum wage lead to inflation? How so? And if so, how do we combat it? And we'll start again with the pros.
It depends. How big is our minimum wage change? Recently,
And that might be something that you mentioned especially for the Oklahoma legislation. What is that proposed increase?
yeah, and I'll get it wrong. It's in the $12-ish range. It's supposed to get up to 15 eventually, and then I believe it's supposed to be tied to inflation thereafter, so that we don't, no offense, we don't have to keep having these discussions. California recently raised their minimum wage for fast food workers in particular, which was a very weird policy. And they raised it to $20 per hour. And the immediate concern is that you're going to cause mass unemployment, mass food price spikes. And we've seen that burgers go up by about 15 cents. And so if you think about like your average restaurant, there's probably a manager who's probably already above the minimum wage. And there's probably 4 to 5 other people who may or may not be at the minimum wage. If you went, let's say, from our current $7.25 up to $12, that's $5 a person. So you need to cover $20 an hour in expenses. You're going to make that up very quickly if you sell a lot of burgers over lunch. And so the volume that a store is able to sell versus the shock of the increase in wage, the pass through to prices is quite small. Now this depends. In some industries, pass through is going to be immediate. It's going to be fast. And it will cause a noticeable increase, but other places we've looked at this is in grocery stores. So grocery stores have high amount of minimum wage type workers. Do grocery prices go up after a minimum wage increase? By about 0.25%. So you take a dollar, And you think about the penny that goes into that dollar, and you think like you shave off Abe Lincoln's ear, that's how much prices have gone up. So yes, they've gone up, but it's able to be spread out over a lot of products. And like the inflationary effects there, I'm not really sure that we see. Now, this all assumes very reasonable minimum wage increases, which I'm not certain that the California one was. I do think the Oklahoma one is, in part because, like you said, we're already at a competitive labor market that has wages that are in that $12 to $13 range. And so 2 years from now, 12 to 13 is still going to feel quite low. I don't know that that's necessarily evidence that we shouldn't do it at all, but I can't expect that that price increase for our 2% of people who are at the minimum wage is going to cause any inflation.
Well, I am on the pro side, so I agree with that. But yes, so we're at 7.25. Oklahoma's minimum wage is 7.25. The goal is to reach to raise it to $15 by 2029, and starting in 2030, raise it according to increases in the consumer price index. There's some claims out there that that means where it's going to be rising by like $10. It's going to be, the minimum wage is going to be $30 in just a few years. That's not true. Other states that have tied theirs to the consumer price index, to inflation, only see their minimum wage going up by a few cents after they, once they tie to inflation. But what I also want to mention is that a review or a study done on the possible impact of the 2022 Congressional Act called Raise the Wage, and to see its effect on inflation, found there was very little real increase in inflation. The federal minimum wage is $7.25. Oklahoma's is tied to the federal one. And even taking the worst case scenario, I should preface, in the 2022 Act, they wanted to raise it to $15 by 2027. So in the analysis, assuming worst case scenario that for every cent that it would rise along the way to $15, they only found that inflation would rise about 0.1% every year for that, for a total of 0.5% raise in inflation because of that raise in minimum wage. How much has inflation risen without any change in minimum wage? If the argument is that raising the minimum wage is going to have this horrible effect on inflation, well, Oklahoma hasn't raised their minimum wage in 15 years, but we're still affected by inflation. It's not something that's tied directly to minimum wage. And so by not acting on it, we're leaving Oklahoma's low wage earners without any increase in income, while we should be working to make sure that also their income can meet the cost of inflation. So it's the effect on inflation will be trivial if it occurs, and we can look to our neighboring states to see the impact, and that inflation still affects them regularly, but it's not just because of their minimum wage increases.
Okay, Dr. Johnson and Professor Davenport.
So I agree that it depends, right? The amount of the adjustment, how much is going to be tied to it. So the Oklahoma one, for example, includes, it stops exemptions from part-time and farm and agriculture. Farm and agriculture is traditionally a very, very low paid. So if you suddenly now almost double that, essentially, that's going to have a big impact, because that low skill applies to a lot of industries, not just, fast food places. It is tied to a lot, especially in this state, right? So think about when the gas prices went up. When gas prices went up, suddenly we started to see costs of everything start to go up, right? Labor is such a big part of everything that we buy and everything that is made. If suddenly everybody at that bottom tier is now, being lifted up, that is a lot of products and a lot of goods that are going to be impacted by that. And what's going to happen to these firms, they're not going to want to take on that extra cost. They're going to want to push that cost on to the consumer. And as you guys pointed out, like even with your estimates, it still happens. We know it happens. It just is a matter of how much does it happen, right? So in an area like Oklahoma, where, a lot of these exemptions are going to be taken away, including students under 18 and part-time workers, that's a lot of the labor force that's going to be impacted. So again, it depends, but it definitely is going to happen. It just is a matter of how much.
Yeah, I think everybody has basically said the same thing. in those industries where you have large numbers of minimum wage workers, so service type industries, again, fast food, these types of places, you might see prices rise. Employers do have other options, though, right? I can minimize the amount I have to raise my prices by reducing hours of workers. I can minimize the amount of prices I have to raise my prices by reducing the benefits I offer to workers, right? So there are options that they have. By the way, none of those options are good for the workers. Just to point that out, if your hours are cut, that's not good, right? If your benefits are reduced, that's not good either. So we're talking about what are the trade-offs available to the employers to minimize, because they know at some price point, you're not going to be as willing to buy from them as you might otherwise. And so they have an incentive to try to find other ways than raising prices to accommodate the increase in the cost of labor. So I think it will be, it probably is more limited to certain industries. The other industries that rely on those industries might see a little bit, but it'll probably be more reduced, to where broadly speaking, I don't think you get inflation per se from an increase in the minimum wage. I just think that the options that employers have to minimize that are not great for workers themselves. And I want to circle back because we were discussing in the previous question about, if we help all of these people and just a few people get hurt, well, that's a greater benefit. But if the people you're hurting are the people who can least afford to be hurt, I think that's a problem that maybe we need to be thinking about. And that's why I think the minimum wage is an errant tool to do that. But as far as inflation goes, I agree with just about everybody here. You're not going to see broad-based significant increases in prices.
So you brought up a good point too, of the people that can least afford to be heard. So I was one of those, again, I started the federal minimum wage, that's $7.25, and I ended up working at a job and I got a lot of training, I put in a lot of overtime, and I got a raise to $9.25. It was a great time. And then South Dakota increased the minimum wage to $9. Did my wage go up? No, my boss wasn't gonna pay me more. And so suddenly, all these people that didn't put in that extra time, didn't put in that extra training, I was now worse off because of that, because everybody else was brought up and I was above the cutoff. And so there are a bunch of people that, would fall into that cutoff too, where they're gonna be hurt by this unintentionally, even if, they're just gonna be hurt by that intentionally, that's all.
I think we see a response coming.
You were frustrated by it, but you weren't hurt by it, right? Your wage did not change. Now, I agree, compression hurts. I'm in academia. I came in at a salary. I've gotten one promotion. It's not what I hoped it was. And inflation has happened this entire time. And every new person we hire essentially gets hired in at a higher rate than me. And they're technically lower on the ladder. And I go like, ugh. But I'm not worse off, right? I'm just frustrated. So I get you. And similar-ish kind of thing happened to me. But your $9.25 was still $9.25. It's just that other people around you, they got paid more.
Oh yeah. It's not going to be the Travis or Dr. Roach and Dr. Johnson show, I promise. No, I agree. But if you tie it to inflation, if inflation goes up because of that increase in minimum wage, now that $9.25, that's not going to offset my increase in higher prices that I have to pay. But as someone that we've also hired people that have come in higher than me, I'm like, doesn't quite feel right.
And this reminds me of a discussion we had in class one time on fairness in income tax. And I had a young mother that was sitting on the front row, and she said, I tell my little boy every day, once you turn 5, life is no longer fair. It's fair, but once you hit 5, just know it's not going to be fair anymore. And I stop and think about that every once in a while. So I've had a few years of not being fair. Okay, next question is, what about universal basic income? Where do you stand on that issue? And would universal basic income be less detrimental to our economy than raising the minimum wage? And universal basic income basically says that everyone starts off with one salary or one payment from the government. And then you build on that. So we'll start at this end, right, with that question.
Actually, I'm a big fan of universal basic income. I know, I'm surprised, right? It's like, what? That can't be right. What'd you do with James? But here's my thinking on this. Number one, I think it is a much better plan for addressing poverty than the hodgepodge of complicated network of poverty assistance programs that we have that take a lot of effort to just figure out if you they're applicable to you, that you are eligible for them. And then if you give $1 over the thing, you lose all of your benefits. And so actually getting a raise is less helpful than you might think. I think the universal basic income is an idea that we should be exploring more and figuring out how can we do things better. I do think it would have, again, we wouldn't be having all these discussions because it's a floor. We can decide what we want that floor to be and get it. And yes, there are all sorts of issues about who gets it and when they get it and this kind of thing, but I think those could be worked out as well as anything else. Having said that, that would mean that's not something that we can just layer on top of what exists, right? There's no way we're going to afford that. So you would have to basically take all of the resources that we're spending now, which is roughly about, well, now probably over $1 trillion a year on social programs, poverty assistance programs, a variety of others that would probably have to be wrapped into this, and then devote it to kind of those direct payments. The state of Alaska kind of has something like this through their, because of their oil revenues, they send a check, I think, to the household or citizens of their state. So there is a model for that I'm sure it's not what they get probably would not be as sufficient for if you want to sort of more broad based, but there is some ideas out there. And I think this is a great one. And I would much prefer be talking about that than
I can't say I agree or disagree. I'm kind of in the neutral. I joke that economists are very data-driven, report-driven. The fact that we all had different reports probably says that. And there's just not a whole lot out there, a lot of conclusive evidence of whether it does or doesn't. Minimum wages, you could find papers you could be reading for the rest of your life, and you still wouldn't cover them all. So I agree that what we have now is this hodgepodge system is a mess. I've always joked with politics, whatever side you're on, we can agree government is inefficient. So I don't have a pro or a con because I just don't have enough information. I think that you should have some more studies done. We should have some more investigatory stuff and then see what the data says more than anything. It definitely shouldn't be added on. It should be, in theory, replaced with that. But what would the impact be of that? That is, before pushing that issue forward, before saying it's better or worse, we need the data. We need to see what the impact is. Sorry, you have your own.
All right, so as an economic security policy analyst, I work with the tools we have. And that means that hodgepodge array of tools at our disposal. So what would it look like to make sure Oklahomans can be more economically secure, that they are able to find a job, and more importantly, stay in a job? Well, we've mentioned the EITC. We work on the Earned Income Tax Credit. Right now, Oklahoma's, they made it refundable, but they tied it to the 2020 federal EITC, which means it's not going to adjust for inflation. As the federal one increases, the Oklahoma one's going to be tied to 2020, but we needed to update. So that's one of the policy things we focus on. We also look at the sales tax relief credit. It's as we know, Oklahoma relies a lot on the sales tax, and that impacts mostly low-income families. So what can we do? We can modernize it, increase the amount families receive back, because right now it's at $40. That's not much at all. And that's something that was said decades ago. So we can modernize it, increase it to a higher amount. That's going to go directly back in the pockets of Oklahomans. As for something we mentioned, that if you make $1 more, then you can lose more in the benefits you receive, perhaps from SNAP, WIC, Medicaid. That's what we call the benefits cliff, where People are discouraged from taking a raise or a promotion because if their wages increase, then they're gonna lose a lot more, I guess you'd say, amount of benefits, Medicaid, sooner care, than they will gain in their wages. So we wanna turn that cliff into a slope. We wanna make sure that the system responds and is built to easing Oklahomans out of it instead of just dropping them to where they don't benefit from taking that promotion to higher wage. Yes, government can be inefficient, but we should have an interest in making it more efficient, in streamlining those processes. And one of the things we can do is single point of entry, which is an integrated benefits application. What does that mean? That means if you apply for SNAP, which used to be known as food stamps, it automatically checks your eligibility for WIC, TANF, Sooner Care. You don't have to go to different agencies. You don't have to prove your income every single time, sign up, fill out an application every single time. That lessens the costs of processing those applications, that makes it more efficient, and you have really an integrated system, increases efficiency. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal right now, and we can focus on improving them and making sure that they're responding to the people who need them the most.
Probably the right answer is that I haven't thought enough about this, is that it is an interesting concept, and I don't want to say yes, no. I worry about the burden that it puts onto the government to provide this when, for instance, part of the reason why we have such broad-sped uptake of SNAP, TANF, Sooner Care, et cetera, is because our industries are not paying a wage, and the federal government has come in to try and supplement that. And so you could make the case that Walmart is free riding on this, and so it would be more efficient to have Walmart pay a higher wage than to have them pay a smaller wage and the federal government come in and supplement that wage. And so, I don't know that we should be involving the government so much to come in and do that when we could do. I agree, it's a sledgehammer for a scalpel problem, but raising the minimum wage does start to help with that. But I'm trying to think of other policies similar to this, like the child tax care credit that recently went away, but was part of the COVID relief packages. Very good evidence that it reduced food poverty countrywide. And it was targeted in a way that I think was smart because I don't have a kid. I did not need that child tax care credit. I kept my job through the entire pandemic. That was not aid or assistance that I needed. And so if I had gotten that, that would have been wasteful government spending, if I'm being fully honest. I would have bought a bike maybe, I don't know. And so, but having something like that is going to reduce burdens in other ways. There's this sociologist she has this line that's become viral, is that other countries have social safety nets, the US has women. So we have taken on this role of caring for households, caring for elderly parents, and a lot of it is unpaid labor, and it mostly comes from women in our country. And so could a UBI assist with that? Maybe, yeah. Could policies like child tax care credits keep, for instance, maybe that mother at home when she would otherwise be out there earning $10 an hour? Like maybe, I can see these being good beneficial policies. And if it's an either or situation, I'm absolutely willing to, think about the trade-off of something like a child tax care credit in lieu of a minimum wage change.
He just triggered me for a second. So I hear this from proponents a lot of times. Well, they're paying such low wages, and so the government's having to make that up. But we have a welfare state, meaning that we have these programs that if you are eligible, you are in. If they weren't employing you at all, the government would be having to pick up the entire amount of that. So you can look at it the way Dr. Roach put it, or you can look at it as the employer is actually relieving the burden of the state by employing them at all. And if you make it harder for them to do that, then you're going to have more people reliant on those state benefits than less. And so, I'm sorry, it is stuck out to me. But and I do think we have a lot of other tools that are in existence, right? We could re-examine occupational licensing and how that is a barrier to entry for a lot of people who are at the lower income levels who can't get into just simple occupations because we have this whole licensing scheme that is costly, time consuming, and weeds them out. So we can look at things like that. We can look at ways of encouraging or making it easier for employers to hire people rather than more difficult. So we do have a lot of policy tools. Again, that comes back to why I think that this is just the wrong one for this particular problem.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left to conclude our hour, and we do have one more question that I'd like to ask. So I'm going to ask that you hold your comments to about 1 minute. As you know, the minimum wage proposal was very widespreadly supported, apparently, to come up for a vote because they collected more than the double number of signatures needed. However, we've got this huge delay in voting on it. So any comments as to why you think Governor Stitt delayed it? And we'll start at the far end again.
Politics.
I'm gonna be a little bit longer than that, but part of it is that, yes, this is the longest delay for a state question in the past 10 years. And we're a little bit concerned about this delay because Oklahoma has enshrined in the Constitution the ballot initiative process to give residents the power to be able to put questions forward that the legislature isn't responding to or that they think is important. Oklahoma hasn't raised the minimum wage for 15 years. Legislators have repeatedly tried to do so through the legislative process. It hasn't happened. So they went forward, put it there, and then it was delayed. That's concerning. But it's not just that. It's also that lawmakers are restricting the ballot initiative process. We already have one of the shortest signature collection times in the countries. We have 90 days to collect a certain percentage of signatures. Other states have almost up to a year. 90 days, almost a year, that's big difference. This session, lawmakers passed a bill to increase the protest period for ballot initiative questions. What does that mean? It means it can cost more money to do those legal defenses. It means that people have to wait longer, and it's another burden. There's also another bill that passed that adds data points that have to be verified of the signatures, which it's very secure. We've had it for many, many years, but now it's increasing again, that burden. So what does it mean? It means it's going to be harder, it's going to take longer, it's going to be more expensive for Oklahomans to be able to use the ballot initiative process, which is protected in the Constitution. So it's not just with minimum wage. We've seen it happen to other state questions, and now it's harder for Oklahomans to use that process.
Yeah, I think it's clear Governor Stitt opposes this measure to begin with. I think so he's going to try to push it back. He doesn't want to have to implement it under his administration. So you can push it back long enough to where another administration would have to pick up and deal with that. I think that's a factor going on there. He wants to give anyone who's opposed to it enough time to mount a campaign against it. And then, I think he has an easy excuse, which he used, which is by putting it on a ballot in which we're already going to have people elections, he doesn't have to call a special election and incur the cost of that. And I think that was an easy excuse to do it.
Politics.
Imagine that, politics interfering in the people's rights. Okay, let's take just a moment and allow each person to kind of have a concluding statement. And because of the way we've gone back and forth, we'll start here and then move across to Dr. Roach.
I think everybody on this panel is in agreement that there are things that we can do to help those at the lower end of the income spectrum, things that we can do that would benefit them. What you have here, though, is a disagreement on this particular policy tool. And from my perspective, as I mentioned at the beginning, I just think it's the wrong tool. It creates more havoc than it solves, and we have other more effective ways of addressing this. And so we will see. One thing, and I'm going to throw this out here now since it's my concluding remark, but that I'll throw out here is, we're probably going to have the opportunity for a natural experiment here in the state of Oklahoma, right? That you're going to have, this will likely pass. I suspect that it will, despite the very articulate opposition that Dr. Johnson and I were able to offer. I think if it goes on the ballot, it will probably pass. And then we can do our own natural experiment here in the state of Oklahoma. And there's a concept that's emerging in academia called adversarial collaboration. So I'm gonna throw that out there. Maybe the Policy Center at UCO would be interested in having a couple of researchers who disagree on this do a project and see if they can come to some conclusion. So I think that'd be a good idea.
I'm really just gonna kind of echo what you said. I mean, I think we all agree that there's a problem. We just are not clear on the solution. And, we may never get to an answer for the solution, right? It's not as easy as 2 + 2 anymore. It involves people, it involves their livelihood, it involves everything. And it involves everyone in the community and the economy. So we don't really know. But it is a sledgehammer trying to fix a scalpel problem. And maybe there are better, more targeted issues like the earned income tax credit, which we all kind of agree is pretty good, that would be better. So maybe it's worth spending time on something that is better, more applied, something that would have a bigger impact on those that are most, the worst off in this situation, those that would have the biggest benefit from this.
Right, so I would say that, yes, the minimum wage is a tool, but it's a tool we can't neglect. We have been doing so for many years. In 2022, Oklahoma's poverty rate was the 8th highest in the nation. 2023, it was the 6th highest. Are we gonna ignore minimum wage as a tool that will directly increase wages? How is poverty counted? Through the wages you make, through how the cost of living breaks down. So why not give Oklahomans the opportunity to vote on this question to raise their wages? It's like I said, a tool we can't leave unused. And we don't have to wait for a natural experiment. States all over the country have raised the minimum wage. We've seen that they're not in the highest rates of unemployment, that prices haven't gone through the roof. We can look at Missouri, one of our neighbors who has raised the minimum wage, to see what happened there. Like I said, no big change in unemployment, no big increase in prices. We can look at Colorado, and I'm just naming states close to us, but there's many more. So raising the minimum wage is, it's an important tool. We have to make sure that the wage floor rises, and we can't just hope that the tight labor market will make sure those wages increase as well.
I'm gonna go a different route and just first say thank you for being here. I appreciate you. I think one of the biggest things you can do with conversations like this and future ones is keep showing up, is keep going and keep learning, because our debate about this 20 years from now, there will be 20 years worth of data in between. And so we will have to keep updating our thoughts and our beliefs, and like going back and be willing to check our expectations. Because there was a time in my life when I was like, oh, minimum wage back. And then reading more has brought me to a different side of that. So keep showing up. And then, you're already here doing the hard work of getting a credential. Keep doing that, get that credential, because that does put you in a pool in the labor market that is less likely to be in that minimum wage category. And so that's one of those things that I tell, when I go with Oklahoma Council on Economic Education, one of the best things you can go and do is get a credential. Is that welding? Is that aircraft fixing? Is that a college degree? Is it a graduate degree? I don't know what that looks like for you, but if it interests you, go for it. Just keep learning.
Okay, I want to thank our panelists, but I also want to take just a moment to see if anyone here has a question before we, even though we've gone a little bit over time, we still want to be sure to answer your questions. Yes, ma'am.
I guess this is more for the on side of the debate. It sounded like either this isn't a big issue and only 2% of the population is affected by low wages, or this is a really big issue and a significant amount of the population is affected by low wages and then going to receive an increase, and that's going to lead to implications. So is there something that I'm missing there in whether it's a small amount of the population, in which case it sounds like it would not have a big impact, or is it a larger percentage of the population? And then second, is there a way to address, because it sounds like issues with implementation of the increase in the minimum wage are the ways businesses will respond to the increase in minimum wage. So are there a hodgepodge of tools that we can implement that would offset businesses from cutting benefits or limiting hours or reducing jobs to both increase the wage and also keep businesses happy?
So as far as the first one, just to clear up some of the question, a lot of the low wages are kind of concentrated in certain industries. So agriculture is the big one. That is one that is very heavily minimum, like lowest paid of the lowest paid. And so it is a small percentage of the population that's going to be impacted by it, but in those industries, it can be very significant.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yes.
As far as the second one, the government has tried to do some job subsidies. So during the 70s and some of that really high inflation, they tried to do, pay for some of these voluntary, or pay to get firms to hire convicts, or ex-convicts, I should clarify that, ex-convicts, veterans, things like that, and it just didn't really work. So, I mean, granted, this was in the 70s, that was 50 years ago, but it hasn't really been a policy that's used very frequently. Not to say it couldn't be, but it is not something that the government has really used. And I mean, minimum wage hasn't changed in 15 years. So if you're trying to get another new government policy added on top of that, it could be another 15 years before that is potentially happening.
Yeah, I think, again, the overall population of those who earn that 725 or below, right, is roughly about 2%, concentrated in specific industries. For that 2%, the decision that we make on this will be very impactful, right? It will filter out to some, right, but based on what happens. But for that, and that, again, that becomes my biggest concern is the very people who can least afford to lose a job or have their hours cut are likely to be the ones who suffer that. And so that's my biggest concern with this particular one. And I don't think the government's history of trying to subsidize businesses, especially in the labor market, it has a lot of success behind it. And so I think you just create more distortions and more problems later on.
Anyone else want to respond in any way?
Not so much, just kind of thinking like agriculture sector in general. One thing that's kind of come up is, the threat of automation in response to a minimum wage. For that to be true, we have to assume that it wouldn't happen but for that minimum wage change. And if we think about things like AI or increased farm productivity tools, that's happening regardless of minimum wage. They've put in the touchscreens everywhere because those got cheaper to make because we've gotten better computers. And so they're installed in states that have high minimum wages and low minimum wages. So I'm not sure that they're causally connected. And so I am concerned about the agriculture sector as well, but also a good case could be made that competition is driving those so far down, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but we're trying to eke out as much inch of a profit we can because we're competing globally. So it's a tough problem.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, let's take this one here. Okay, the second question, how does it affect small business? And did you all hear the first part?
Yes,
Okay,
I was writing them down. So you're asking, considering these big corporations that, do tend to pay higher wages, considering them, and then how much is actually coming back into the economy and how are small businesses affected? Okay, so yes, that is one of the concerns, that because it is those larger corporations that have the ability to meet those higher wages that already do perhaps pay more than 15, that it would be small businesses, local businesses that would be, have the short end of the stick when it comes to the minimum wage. But again, research has shown that that's not really the case. There are ways for businesses to adapt. They don't just have to pass on the cost to consumers. Whenever you pay your workers more, you have increased productivity, people stay in jobs longer. And there's, like I said, there's various ways they can adjust, and I would love to connect you to those resources so I don't accidentally misspeak on ways they can do that. But as to the second question, how much will small businesses benefit? Well, quite a bit, because for every certain dollar amount that's spent on Amazon or Temu, as you said, a smaller proportion stays in the local economy. But if you spend in a small business, at a restaurant, more of that money stays in the local industry. I put out an article on that does get into the specific numbers on our page, okpolicy.org, that you can look into it for specifics. But that's just to say that it comes back to the point that when Oklahomans have more spendable income, yes, they will spend some of it on Amazon because it's convenient, because it may be cheaper, but they will also go eat at a restaurant. They will also go to a night market, to a small trinket shop. So it's a rising tide lifts all boats. Small businesses will also benefit from this.
It's a cool question. And I'm going to be purely speculative here, but this is kind of something drawing from like what we see with some of the immigration literature, is this concern that new immigration comes in, displaces jobs, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those studies end up being this kind of like no real net effect, because these new people coming in and taking new jobs, they are also demanders. And so it's growing some of these other sectors. So like it's gonna depend. There will be small businesses that go out of business because they can't afford it. But there might be, like you were saying, there's some that suddenly they have more people because there's just generally more income in the area. And I don't think we can know beforehand.
No, I've heard a couple of this times mention of productivity gains by increased wages. I think it's important to understand, what do we mean by productivity, right? Because and one comment, I don't know if this was like, well, they'll stay in the job longer, but that doesn't speak to productivity. If you're talking about, are they doing better, right? And the second reason is why low-wage people don't stay in their jobs longer is because they get better opportunities. So most people, again, if you look at the minimum wage, very few people are working for the minimum wage for years and years and years at a time. I'm going to go out and say almost nobody is working for the minimum wage year after year after year for multiple years, right? Because they do get better opportunities, and as they gain experience and as they gain job knowledge and such, they can go and find better jobs. And so, and I'm skeptical that, well, I think the literature is clear. If you get a raise, and that raise is tied to your employer basically saying, hey, you did a good job and such, your productivity is going to remain. I'm more skeptical about, we're giving you a raise because we have to, and you didn't have to do anything to earn it, that actually produces greater productivity. I'm a little skeptical about that. That's all it is.
If I was remiss to not mention this at the beginning, but analysis on what the impact of Oklahoma's minimum wage increase would be says that 200,000 individuals would be directly impacted, and more than 300,000 would be directly and indirectly impacted. And I'm happy to talk with you after this about what that means, but that's a sizable amount of people.
Okay, we have a question in the back.
Yeah, I was listening to the conversations going on about low income and I know that this is kind of a far-fetched thing, and I know that low income people will hopefully benefit from the increase and not lose their benefit. But what about people who are retired living on Social Security? Where would they fall in between it? They would fall through the cracks. A lot of people can't qualify for SNAP benefits or state assistance, even though they have a low income, and the government does not provide a large increase in wages. How do you see that they will fare if this increase goes through and it causes inflation to rise even more.
It concerns me for sure. Also, happy birthday. We already tie some of these programs to inflation with the hope that, and now it will be at a lag. If there's bad inflation last year and it catches up next year when that number updates, you had a year of like lag time that was bad. But the hope would be that those benefits should, all else equal, stay the same over time. You should have the same spending power with those benefits. And then again, just any effects minimum wage causing inflation looks to be very small, if at all. So it doesn't really concern me, but that supposes that we keep tying some of these retirement, social security, et cetera, to inflation and keeping that balance. I don't love it. No, I don't think that's great. It came as part of your taxes originally. I would be very fine with a robust social safety net, especially in your older years, that, let's treat, again, I'm an academic. One of the benefits of this job is I essentially have a pension system. So my retirement is set right now. It is not dependent on how much I did or didn't put in. It's based on, it's a formula. I'd be totally fine with the rest of society having this kind of formula system and not then having that tax later.
Well, and just for clarification, Oklahoma does not tax Social Security, only the federal government taxes it. Now, there are some states that do tax Social Security, New Mexico being one of them. I'm in that bracket, so I pay attention to those things.
Yeah, but it still affects people, that fall between the cracks. They make
Absolutely.
a little bit too much money to qualify for like Medicaid or Medicare, especially if you retire early at 62. And so for 3 years there, you have no insurance, you have no benefits, you have nothing. And those people get hurt the worst because if they get taken to the hospital or through an accident, they're the ones that hurt the worst on the part of it.
And one of your early points mentioned inflation. And back whenever we were talking about that question, I mentioned that in the worst case scenario, raising at $15, according to a past study done on the federal raising minimum wage, would increase it by 0.5. Just in perspective, last year, without any change in minimum wage, it increased by more than 4%. So that's like 0.5 to 4%. That's what we're looking at. As to the dropping off your benefits, again, that's what we call the benefit cliff. And that's where we can bring in other tools. We can raise the income eligibility so more people qualify. We can turn that cliff into a slope so people can earn more money without being completely dropped off their healthcare. And there's a variety of options we have in order to address those things. The issue is getting them passed. So I guess I have to plug, if you're interested in getting involved with our organization, yes, we do policy work, but we also do outreach where if you want to get involved with, really pushing for those changes, talking with your legislator about why this is important to you and why we should raise the income limit, why we should care about something that affects you. We help teach you how to do that part of advocacy and really getting in contact with your lawmakers.
I was just gonna say, this kind of goes with the example that I talked about where I worked hard, I got my raise, and suddenly I was now worse off because of that. And I think Social Security kind of falls into that same realm of, if now the low income earners, even if inflation only causes a small percent, your wages haven't changed. And this will be the same for people that, were slightly above the minimum and now the minimum wage comes in and not gonna happen, they don't see that positive return too. And so just like the Social Security and things like that, there's gonna be some people that fall through the cracks, and that's where, those people are worse off, even if inflation only goes up by 0.1% or whatever it is. And that just kind of ties to, again, the potential negative, the potential costs of increasing that minimum wage.
We got one last question online. Pine Tree High School, how does the minimum wage secure or threaten the economy, and what is the long-term and short-term effects of it?
We have another hour.
No.
I'll try to take a stab at it.
Yeah.
I hate questions about the economy. It's like it's this big monolithic. I think of the Borg in Star Trek when people use the word economy, like it's just this big thing that is separate from us, which it's not, right? We are the economy. So I don't care if it hurts the economy. I care if it hurts people. And I think as our discussion, there's some disagreement about who might be hurt, where they might be hurt, how they can do it. And so from, again, just, I think that's what people have to decide and try to figure out is with any given policy, there are trade-offs. There's no magic pill that's going to solve that you can do this one thing and it's going to solve all the problems. So we have to identify what's the best tool for the particular problem we're trying to address. And I think we've done a good job of articulating our positions on that. I hope we have anyway. And again, if and when this passes, as I said, I think it will, we'll have the opportunity to conduct our own natural experiment here in Oklahoma and have even more precise data about the impact, which I think is a great thing.
Always try to remind students it's not us versus them, it's us, period. It's all of us. Anyone else want to respond? One other question here.
So unemployment is going to happen when it's going to happen anyway. Whether it does happen, wages go up. Wouldn't a better question to ask would be, how can more people know and have access to USAJobs.gov, the many jobs and government jobs out there and the programs and organizations that help people earn jobs? Wouldn't that be a better question to ask? To get more people who has access to that and knowledge to that?
Totally agree. Cool question, cool thought process on this. And like just building up our knowledge base about how to go get this job, the availability of job. The internet obviously has made this better, but the first time I went looking for a job, I just walked into the door and said, "Are you hiring?" And yes, no. And I did that in the entire mall, and I did that at several restaurants. I did that at some grocery stores, and I filled out, several paper-based applications that took forever. And so I hope that there's, with advances, that is getting easier. It'd be great to have a repository for every, because one of the issues is that there are too many jobs. There's a lot of people who would like to hire that haven't been able to hire. And maybe having one single repository to go like, I'm going to just go look for jobs. And you go to a website, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, as someone that was recently hired, I went to so many websites trying to be like, okay, who's hiring, where, what is the information, what do they need to submit? And it was a nightmare. If there was a way to centralize it, if there was a way to make it easier and a way to even, apply to multiple locations at once. So I know, again, when I enrolled in college, you had to go to that school, you had to submit all your stuff to them, and now you can do multiple with one application. And it's a great thing. It is opening you, just like you mentioned with all the other resources that you could potentially apply to. If there was a way to make it easier, that's fantastic. It's a matter of how to do that, how to go about that and actually, make people aware of this stuff. That's a whole separate issue that is not solved overnight, for sure.
And I think that's why economists refer to that as frictional unemployment.
Yeah,
because it's a challenge to find that right match.
So I would also briefly mention, I think we've seen some kind of private sector innovations in this, like Indeed.com or other websites where you fill in, put in your resume and close it out to employers as an attempt to do that. As part of my job, we also look to neighboring states to see what they do, like stateside, and something that might interest you is looking at Montana, and what they do is called Montana Help Link. I'm not wrong, but basically it's kind of like an office of employment where individuals can go and get help in looking for a job, and also I believe they connect them with resources. So there are some attempts in other states to do this more on the state government side and not just private sector side.
Any other questions? Okay.
Mine's really quick, but I wanted to know, I know you guys did a right program over, but but why is the minimum wage increase in increments? Because like by 2026, it's like 12 to 50 or something like that. So why did they write it that way? And do you think like has it impacted me that way, or I don't know? What are your thoughts on this?
If you suddenly go and jack the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15,
Yeah.
it is an immediate reaction, right? It is built this way to slowly bring it back up to that point, right? You can't do anything immediately overnight. You have to slowly increment it. And so it is designed to get to a point where, you know, it feels stable, and then from that point on, it's tied to the consumer price index, so it's tied to inflation. And so from that point, it'll have those increments built in, and we won't have such a significant jump. So the bigger that jump is, the bigger the impacts are gonna be. Right? If you go to the store and you go to buy something and it went up by 5 cents, you're like, oh, okay, it sucks. If it goes up by $5, you're like, oh my gosh, right? And minimum wage is the same way. Firms are gonna react the same way.
Any other comments? Any other questions? Well, again, thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks to those that have joined us online as well. We appreciate it, and thanks again to our panelists. Let's give them a nice hand.